The hammer struck red-hot iron with the same rhythm it had for 3 years now. Thomas Mitchell wiped sweat from his brow as the morning sun streamed through the open doors of Henderson's smithy in the dusty town of Copper Ridge. At 19, most folks still saw him as nothing more than old Henrik's apprentice, the quiet boy who kept the forge burning and rarely spoke unless spoken to. But Thomas carried secrets that would soon shake the very foundations of their small railroad town. The year was 1882. The Central Mountain Railroad had transformed Copper Ridge, a forgotten mining settlement, into a bustling hub of commerce. Trains arrived daily, carrying passengers, freight, mysterious cargo that disappeared into heavily guarded warehouse on the outskirts of town. Thomas had noticed things others hadn't: late-night activities, armed guards, and whispered conversations that stopped whenever locals approached. Henrik hammered away at a horseshoe, his weathered hand steady despite his 70 years. "Thomas, that coupling rod for the railroad needs finishing today," he called over the ringing of metal. "They're mighty particular about their deadlines." Thomas nodded, but his mind wandered to the strange request 3 days ago. A well-dressed railroad executive had personally visited their humble smithy, requesting a very specific lock mechanism, one that required a complex series of turns and pressures. The man had paid triple their usual rate and insisted on the utmost. As Thomas worked the bellows, life into the glowing coals, he recalled the executive's nervous demeanor. The man had repeatedly glanced over his shoulder and spoke in hushed tones about securing certain assets and protecting company interests. Most peculiar was his insistence that Thomas destroy all sketches and measurements once the work was complete. The morning passed quickly, and by noon Thomas had completed the intricate lock mechanism. Its bronze surface gleamed with an almost hypnotic, and the internal working so precise that only someone with intimate knowledge of its construction could hope to open it. He studied his creation, memorizing every detail before constructed, feeding his sketches of forge's hungry. Henrik examined the finished piece with admiration. "Fine work, lad, though I wonder what they need such a complicated for. Seems mighty excessive for a simple storage room." Their speculation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 railroad men, not the nervous executive from before, but hardened security personnel, stern faces, calculating eyes. The larger of the 2, a man with a thick mustache and silver belt, spoke with authority. "We're here for the special order," he announced, his hand resting casually on the grip of his pistol. "I trust it meets specifications." Thomas handed over the lock mechanism, noting how both men examined it carefully before exchanging meaningful glances. Payment was made quickly, in gold coins rather than the usual currency, and the men departed without the customary pleasantries that marked most business transactions in Copper Ridge. "Something's not right about all this," Henrik muttered, watching them disappear down the dusty main street. "In 40 years of smithing, I've never seen railroad men so secretive about a simple lock." That evening, as Thomas cleaned the shop and banked the forge for the night, his curiosity got the better of him. The railroad compound sat just beyond the town limits, and under cover of darkness he might be able to discover what required such an elaborate security measure. Against his better judgment, he found himself walking through the moonlit streets toward the collection of warehouses and administrative buildings that housed the Central Mountain Railroad's local operation. The compound was larger than it appeared from town, with multiple buildings surrounded by a high wooden fence. Guards patrolled the perimeter, but Thomas knew these grounds well. He'd delivered commissioned ironwork here many times over the years. Using his familiarity with the layout, he slipped through a gap in the fence near the maintenance. What he discovered would change everything. Hidden behind the main warehouse stood a smaller, nondescript building that didn't appear on any of the railroad's public documentation. Unlike the other structures, this one had no windows and only a single, heavily reinforced door. As Thomas crept closer, he recognized his handiwork. The intricate lock mechanism he'd created was already installed and appeared to be the only thing securing whatever lay within. But this discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why would the railroad need such secrecy in a small town like Copper Ridge? What could be so valuable or dangerous that it required not just hiding, but a lock so complex that even skilled craftsmen would struggle to bypass it? Thomas was about to retreat when he heard approaching footsteps. Diving behind a stack of railroad ties, he watched as three figures approached the mysterious building. The first was the nervous executive who had commissioned the lock. The second was someone Thomas didn't recognize, a woman in expensive traveling clothes who carried herself with obvious authority. The third figure made Thomas's blood run. Samuel Morrison, Copper Ridge's own mayor and supposedly a champion of interest. The transfer needs to before the federal investigators arrive, the woman was. Washington is getting suspicious about the missing allocation. Mayor Morrison shifted. The documentation will show everything went to legitimate infrastructure project. No one in town knows about the diversion, and they never will. What about the blacksmith who made the lock? The executive asked nervously. He and his apprentice know it exists. The woman's response chilled Thomas to the bone. Henrik is old and doesn't ask questions. As for the boy, he's a nobody. If he becomes a problem, there are ways to ensure his silence permanently. Thomas remained hidden. They unlocked the door using the mechanism he'd created. The brief glimpse inside revealed stacks of wooden crates and metal strongbox, far more wealth than any legitimate railroad operation in Copper Ridge possessed. After the three conspirators disappeared, Thomas read carefully, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd. Over the following days, Thomas struggled with his discovery. The conversation he'd overheard suggested large-scale theft from federal railroad development funds. Money meant to improve transportation infrastructure across the territory was instead being diverted and hidden in Copper Ridge. Mayor Morrison's involvement meant the corruption reached into the highest levels of local government, but Thomas faced a terrible dilemma. As a 19-year-old apprentice with no social standing, who would believe his accusations against the mayor and railroad executives? Worse, the woman's casual mention of ensuring his silence permanently suggested that coming forward might cost. The answer came from an unexpected source. 1 week after his midnight reconnaissance, Thomas was working alone in the smithy when a stranger. The man was tall and lean, with gray hair, and the kind of steady gaze that spoke of years in law enforcement. He wore a simple brown coat, but something in his bearing suggested authority that transcended local politics. "You're Thomas Mitchell," the question. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" The man smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "My name is Jonathan Fletcher. I'm a federal marshal investigating irregularities in railroad development funding across this territory. I have reason to believe you might have information that could help my investigation." Thomas felt his heart race. "I'm just a blacksmith's apprentice. I don't know anything about railroad." Fletcher studied him carefully. 3 weeks ago, you created a very sophisticated lock mechanism for the Central Mountain Railroad. That lock is currently securing a building that doesn't officially exist, containing assets that shouldn't be there. I know this because I've been watching the compound for 2 months, waiting for the right moment to act. The revelation that a federal marshal was already investigating provided Thomas with relief and terror. Relief that he wasn't alone in his suspicions, but terror at the confirmation that his life might indeed be in danger. "They know you witnessed their meeting. Morrison has been asking questions about you around town, and the railroad has been making inquiries about your background connection. They're trying to determine if you pose a..." Thomas felt the walls closing in. "What do you want from your help? That lock you created is too complex for us to bypass without risking destruction of evidence inside. We need the builder's knowledge to open it cleanly. In exchange, I can offer you protection and a chance to see justice done." The choice before Thomas was stark: help the federal marshal and risk everything, or remain silent and hope the conspirators would leave him alone. But deep down, he knew there was really no choice at all. People like Morrison, the railroad executive, didn't leave ends, and he had already seen too. "What would you need me to do?" Both simple and audacious. The conspirators were planning another late-night meeting in 3 days to oversee the transfer of the hidden wealth to a secret location before federal oversight could discover its existence. Fletcher's team would wait until all the key players were inside the building, then move in for arrest. Thomas would be essential for quickly opening the lock without triggering any potential destruction mechanism. But the plan required to continue his normal routine while secret preparing. Any change in behavior might alert the conspirators that their activities were under investigation. For 3 days, Thomas had to hammer iron, bank fire, and interact with townspeople as if nothing had changed, all while knowing that armed federal marshals were positioning themselves around. The most difficult part was hiding his knowledge from Henrik. The old blacksmith had been like a father to Thomas since his own parents' passing 5 years earlier. Keeping secrets from Henrik felt like a betrayal, but Fletcher had insisted that the fewer people who knew about the operation, the better chance it had of succeeding. On the appointed night, Thomas made his way to a predetermined meeting point near the railroad compound. Fletcher and 3 other marshals were waiting, their faces blackened with soot, and their movements silent as shadows. Each man carried the kind of weaponry that spoke of serious federal authority, repeating rifles and pistols that far exceeded anything the local railroad security could match. "Remember," Fletcher whispered as they approached the fence, "your job is to open that lock quickly and quietly. Once we're inside, stay back and let us handle any confrontation that might." Thomas nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as they crossed into the... Everything he had worked for, his apprenticeship, his place in the community, perhaps even his life, depended on the next hour going according to plan. The mysterious building stood exactly as Thomas remembered it, but now voices could be heard. The conspirators were already conducting their business, unaware that federal law enforcement was closing in. Fletcher positioned his men at strategic points around the building, while Thomas approached the lock mechanism he had created weeks earlier. In the moonlight, the bronze surface seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Thomas's fingers found the sequence he had memorized, a complex series of turns and pressures that would release the internal mechanism. As the final tumbler fell into place, the lock opened with a soft click that seemed thunderous in the night air. Fletcher nodded to his men, and they burst through the door with the coordinated precision of experienced lawmen. "Federal marshals, you're all under arrest." The scene inside was even more shocking than Thomas had imagined. The building contained not just stolen railroad development funds, but evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond Copper Ridge. Documents scattered across makeshift tables revealed a network of corruption spanning multiple territories, with millions of dollars diverted for legitimate infrastructure projects into private. Mayor Morrison tried to reach for a pistol, but found himself 3 federal weapons. The nervous railroad executive simply raised his hands in surrender, while the well-dressed woman attempted to maintain her composure, even as Fletcher placed iron restraints around her wrist. "Sarah Worthington," Fletcher announced as he arrested the woman, also known as Sarah Phillips, Sarah Montgomery, and at least 4 other aliases, "you're wanted for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy in 6 different territories." As the marshals secured their prisoners and began cataloging evidence, Thomas realized the full scope of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just local corruption. It was part of an organized effort to steal federal reconstruction funds intended to help build the infrastructure that would bind the growing nation together. The immediate aftermath, a whirlwind of activity. Federal reinforcements arrived before dawn, and by morning the entire railroad compound was under federal control. Word spread quickly through Copper Ridge that their mayor and the railroad executives had been arrested for crimes against the federal government, but Thomas's role in the operation remained secret at Fletcher's insistence. "The fewer people who know about your involvement, the safer you'll be. There might be other members of this conspiracy who weren't caught last night." Indeed, over the following weeks, additional arrests were made across the territory as the full extent of the corruption network became clear. The stolen funds were recovered and eventually redirected to their intended purposes, building the railroads, bridges, and telegraph lines that would help unite the West. For Thomas, the experience had been transformative in ways he couldn't have imagined. Fletcher offered him a position as a federal deputy, recognizing the young man's courage and keen observational skills. But Thomas surprised the marshal's response. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I think I can do more good right here in Copper Ridge. People need to know they can trust their local institution, and somebody has to help rebuild that trust." Henrik, who learned the truth only after the arrests made public, was amazed by his apprentice's transformation. "You're not the same quiet boy who started working here 3 years ago," he observed. "You've grown into a man who stands up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." Thomas had indeed changed, but not in the way he had expected when he first discovered that mysterious building. The experience had taught him that ordinary people, even blacksmith apprentices, could make extraordinary differences when they chose to act with courage and conviction. The new mayor, elected in a special election after Morrison's arrest, appointed Thomas to the town council despite his youth. The position allowed him to help ensure that Copper Ridge's government would operate with the transparency and honesty that its citizens deserved. The railroad eventually resumed normal operations under new management with federal oversight, ensuring that development funds reached their intended destination. The mysterious building was converted into a legitimate warehouse, and the complex lock mechanism Thomas had created was preserved as evidence in the federal case that would eventually see all the conspirators convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. But perhaps the most significant change was in Thomas himself. No longer content to simply follow instruction to keep his head down, he had learned to question authority when it acted suspiciously and to take action witnessed wrongdoing. The skills he had developed as a blacksmith, attention to detail, patience, and the ability to work with precision under pressure had proven valuable in ways he never could have anticipated. Years later, when travelers passed through Copper Ridge and remarked on the town's reputation for honest government and fair dealing, longtime residents would sometimes tell the story of how their community had been saved by an observant young man who refused to stay silent. They would speak of the night when federal marshals arrested a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government, and how the evidence had been secured by someone who understood that even the most complex locks could be opened by those who possessed both the knowledge and the courage to turn the key. Thomas Mitchell remained in Copper Ridge for the rest of his life, eventually taking over Henrich's smithy and training apprentices of his own. He married Clara Henderson, the schoolteacher who had admired his quiet courage long before anyone else recognized. Together they raised 3 children in a town where honesty and integrity were valued above wealth and position. But Thomas never forgot that moonlit night when he had chosen to act rather than remain. He taught his children and his apprentices that skill and knowledge meant nothing without the wisdom to use them in service of justice and the courage to stand up against wrongdoing, regardless of the personal cost. The vault that the railroad had tried to hide became a symbol of something larger, the idea that secrets and corruption could not survive in the light of truth, and that ordinary people possessed the power to change their communities the better when they chose to act with honor and determination. Thomas Mitchell had started as just a blacksmith's apprentice, content to work quietly in the shadows of more prominent men. But when he unlocked that vault and exposed the conspiracy within, he had unlocked something far more valuable: his own potential to be a force for good in a world that desperately needed people willing to stand up for what was right. The boy who had once seen himself as nobody special had discovered that heroism didn't require special birth or extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes it just required an ordinary person willing to do the extraordinary thing when the moment demanded it. And in doing so, Thomas had unlocked not just a physical vault filled with stolen treasure, but the door to a life of purpose and meaning that he had never imagined. In the end, the greatest treasure wasn't the gold and silver that had been recovered from the hidden building, but the knowledge that courage and conscience could triumph over corruption and greed. That was a lesson worth more than all the stolen railroad funds combined, and it was a treasure that Thomas Mitchell would carry with him his day.